do you stand at the base of a dam at noon, watch water leak through its foundation, declare it safe, and kill 431 people before sunrise? I went looking for the inspection report, and what I found was not an engineering failure in the way I expected. It was a single man standing in a canyon in California, looking at dirty water seeping from the rock beneath a wall he had designed, a wall he had built, a wall he had certified, and deciding that what he was seeing did not mean what it meant. His name was William Mulholland. In March of 1928, he was 62 years old, and he was the most famous civil engineer in the United States. He had no formal engineering degree. He had never attended a university. He arrived in California from Ireland by way of New York, working on merchant ships and dredging operations and lumber camps before landing in Los Angeles in 1877. His first job with the city's water system was as a ditch digger, a zanjero, clearing and maintaining the open irrigation ditches that carried water through a city of 11,000 people. He read engineering textbooks at night by the light of an oil lamp. He taught himself surveying. He taught himself hydraulics. He taught himself geology, as best he could at the time. He rose from ditch digger to foreman, from foreman to superintendent of the entire Los Angeles water system. By 1902, he was the most powerful public works official in the city. By 1913, he was a national figure. He had built the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The aqueduct was 233 miles long. It carried water by gravity alone from the Owens River Valley, on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, across the Mojave Desert, through mountains and across valleys, and into a city that could not have existed without it. The engineering was extraordinary. The ambition was extraordinary. The politics were brutal. Agents for the city had quietly purchased water rights in the Owens Valley before the project was announced, drying up the farms and ranches that depended on the river. The Owens Valley farmers would eventually dynamite sections of the aqueduct in protest. The water wars between Los Angeles and the Owens Valley are one of the most infamous episodes in California history. The aqueduct made the city possible. The city consumed the valley that fed it. And at the center of all of it stood William Mulholland, the self-taught engineer who had designed the system and who believed with absolute conviction that he understood water and the ground it moved through. That belief is the foundation of this story, not the concrete, not the geology, the belief. The St. Francis Dam was a curved concrete gravity dam, 185 feet high, built across San Francisquito Canyon in the Sierra Pelona Mountains, approximately 40 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles and roughly 10 miles north of what is now the city of Santa Clarita. Its purpose was to create a large storage and regulating reservoir for the Los Angeles Aqueduct, a secondary water supply that would ensure the city had reserves during periods of drought or disruption. The reservoir behind the dam held 38,000 acre-feet of water when full. That is approximately 12.4 billion gallons. A lake 3 miles long filled a narrow canyon between steep mountain walls. Construction began in August 1924. 175,000 cubic yards of concrete were poured over the next 18 months at a cost of $1.23 million. The dam was completed and the reservoir began filling in March 1926. Mulholland designed it. Mulholland supervised the construction. Mulholland selected the site. Mulholland approved the foundation. There was no independent engineering review. There was no outside consultant. There was no second opinion from any engineer who was not employed by Mulholland's own department. And there was no geological survey of the canyon walls or the material beneath the dam. I need to stop on that last point because it is the one that decides everything that follows. A gravity dam holds water by its own mass. The weight of the concrete pushes down against the upward and horizontal forces exerted by the water pressing against the upstream face. If the foundation beneath the dam is solid, competent bedrock, the weight transfers cleanly into the earth and the structure holds. If the foundation is fractured or porous or composed of material that weakens when it absorbs water, the dam's weight has nowhere to go. The water finds the cracks. It seeps beneath the structure. It saturates the rock. It erodes the foundation from below, washing material out grain by grain. The dam does not crack apart the way a boiler does or a bridge does. It loses the ground it was standing on. It lifts, it tilts, it slides. And when a gravity dam loses its foundation, there is nothing left to hold back the water. The St. Francis Dam was built on 3 geological formations that were, in combination, catastrophically unsuitable for a dam of that height and that water load. The western abutment, the left side of the dam as you face downstream, rested on the Sespe Formation, a reddish-brown sedimentary sandstone that absorbs water readily and loses structural integrity when saturated. The Sespe looks solid when dry. When wet, it weakens, it swells, it crumbles. It was holding up a 185-foot wall of concrete pressing against 12.4 billion gallons of water. The eastern abutment rested on Pelona schist, a mica-rich metamorphic rock that is heavily foliated, meaning it has planes of weakness running through it like the pages of a closed book. Water does not pass through solid schist easily, but water moves along the foliation planes, along the fractures, along the ancient slip surfaces where the rock has moved before. Beneath the eastern abutment, hidden under a veneer of stable-looking surface rock, sat the remains of a massive Pleistocene-age landslide. Ground that had already failed once, thousands of years before Mulholland was born. Ground that was sitting there, waiting for 12.4 billion gallons of water to reactivate it. Between the 2 abutments, running through the stream bed beneath the dam, was a thrust fault, a geological discontinuity where 2 formations had been pushed against each other by ancient tectonic forces, creating a zone of fractured, incompetent rock directly beneath the center of the structure. Charles Paul, a contemporary dam engineer, wrote that it was essential to have a careful geological examination of the foundation conditions for any dam. Ideally, that means an investigation and a report by an expert practical geologist, assessing the bedrock's likelihood of fissures, faulting, and past upheavals or disturbance. A study of that kind at the St. Francis Dam site would almost certainly have uncovered the schist's permeability, the Sespe's weakness, the thrust fault, and the ancient landslide, but Mulholland did not commission such a study. He and a Stanford geology professor briefly visited the canyon before design began. They walked the site. They looked at the surface. That was the geological investigation. A visit, not core samples, not a subsurface investigation. A visit by a man who believed he understood the ground because he had been building on it for 30 years. And then, during construction, Mulholland raised the dam's height. The original design called for 175 feet. He increased it to 185 feet to store additional water, 10 more feet of height, and thousands more acre-feet of capacity. He did not widen the base of the dam to compensate. He did not recalculate the uplift pressures that would act on the larger structure. He did not reassess the foundation loadings. He added 20% more water pressure to the top of a wall, without adding any additional resistance at the bottom, and the bottom was sitting on rock he had never drilled into, never tested, and never had a geologist evaluate. The dam initially functioned. For 2 years, as the reservoir slowly filled, the structure appeared to perform as designed. Leaks and seepage were observed, but Mulholland dismissed them as normal for a large concrete dam in its early years of operation. Water does seep through concrete, and that is not unusual. What matters is the volume, the clarity, and the trend. Clear seepage that remains stable is generally acceptable. Muddy seepage that increases over time is not. It means the water is carrying material, and it means the foundation is eroding. By March 1928, after a wet winter, the reservoir was essentially full, about 3 inches below the spillway crest, holding 38,000 acre-feet, 12.4 billion gallons pressing against 185 feet of concrete on a foundation that William Mulholland had visited once and never tested. On the morning of March 12, 1928, the dam keeper Tony Harnischfeger discovered a new leak on the western abutment. He had worked at the dam since it opened, and he knew what normal seepage looked like. This water was different. It was muddy, dirty. It was carrying something with it. Harnischfeger understood what dirty water likely meant. It meant the leak was washing foundation material from beneath the dam, and it meant the Sespe sandstone on the western side was dissolving under pressure. He called Mulholland immediately. Mulholland drove out from Los Angeles with his assistant superintendent, Harvey Van Norman. They arrived at the dam and spent approximately 2 hours inspecting it. They examined the leak on the western abutment. Van Norman traced the source of the dirty water and followed the runoff downstream. He concluded that The muddy appearance came not from the dam's foundation, but from where the discharge contacted loose soil from a newly cut access road nearby. The leak was discharging 2 to 3 cubic feet per second, roughly 15 to 22 gallons per second. Mulholland and Van Norman concluded that the seepage was not unusual for a dam of this size, that the muddy water was explained by the road construction, and that the dam was safe. They drove back to Los Angeles. Tony Harnischfeger lived with his 6-year-old son Coder in a small cottage roughly a quarter-mile downstream of the dam. His wife Gladys and his daughter were no longer living with him. A woman named Leona Johnson lived with the family and helped care for the boy. They were the closest residents to the dam. A quarter-mile, less than a 5-minute walk from the base of 185 feet of concrete, holding back 12.4 billion gallons of water. At 2.5 minutes before midnight on March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam catastrophically failed. The precise time is known because the collapse severed a Southern California Edison 70 kilovolt power line on the Borel transmission route, which ran immediately downstream of the dam. The interruption was recorded at the company's monitoring station. 11:57 and 30 seconds p.m. There were no surviving eyewitnesses to the collapse. At least 5 people had passed the dam in the hour before it failed without noticing anything out of the ordinary. The last person to see the dam intact was Ace Hopewell, a carpenter at Powerhouse No. 1, who rode his motorcycle past the dam roughly 10 minutes before midnight. At the coroner's inquest, Hopewell testified that he saw nothing at the dam or at Powerhouse No. 2 that caused him concern. About 1.5 miles upstream, above the sound of his motorcycle engine, he heard a rumbling like the sound of rocks falling. He did not stop. He did not turn around. He continued to the powerhouse, where he learned that the dam had ruptured. What happened in the final minutes has been reconstructed from the physical evidence by the engineer and geologist J. David Rogers and others. By approximately 11:55 p.m., water seeping through the Pelona schist on the eastern abutment had begun reactivating the ancient landslide buried beneath it. The saturated rock was losing its ability to bear the weight of the dam and resist the horizontal pressure of the reservoir. A massive section of the eastern abutment, identified by investigators as Block 35, broke away from the dam face. The separation created what engineers would later describe as a nozzle, a gap through which the full hydrostatic pressure of 12.4 billion gallons of water began forcing its way. The water pouring through the gap accelerated the landslide. The landslide undercut the dam further. At 11:57 and 30 seconds p.m., the entire eastern abutment gave way and the dam came apart. The western abutment, its Sespe sandstone foundation already saturated and weakened, failed moments later. Only the center section of the dam remained standing, a ragged slab of concrete that people would begin calling the tombstone. A wall of water 140 feet high entered San Francisquito Canyon, traveling at roughly 18 miles per hour. It carried pieces of the dam with it, not fragments, not rubble, but pieces, 1,000-ton blocks of concrete tumbling in the current like driftwood. The largest single block recovered after the flood weighed 10,000 tons. It was found 1,500 feet downstream from the dam. It was 61 feet tall. A photograph taken after the disaster shows 2 men standing in front of it. They reach approximately to the base of the lowest visible fracture line. They are the size of insects beside it. The first people the water reached were Tony Harnischfeger, his son Coder, and Leona Johnson. Their cottage was a quarter-mile downstream. At 140 feet high and traveling 18 miles per hour, the wave reached them in seconds. The body of Leona Johnson was found fully clothed, wedged between 2 blocks of concrete near the base of the dam, which led investigators to suggest that she and possibly Tony Harnischfeger had been outside inspecting the structure in the minutes before the collapse. Perhaps they heard something. Perhaps they saw the eastern abutment shift. Her body tells us she was awake, dressed and near the dam when it went. Tony Harnischfeger's body was never found. His 6-year-old son Coder's body was never found. 5 minutes after the collapse, the wave, still 120 feet high, had traveled 1.5 miles and struck Powerhouse No. 2, a Southern California Edison generating station where 67 workers and their families lived in a camp of small houses and tents nearby. 64 of the 67 people at the camp were killed. Further downstream, 84 Edison workers sleeping in tents at a separate construction camp were swept away. The flood had been in motion for less than 10 minutes and had already killed more than 150 people. The water entered the Santa Clara River Valley and began to spread. It tore through the Camulos Ranch, ripping orange trees from the ground by the hundreds, carrying them downstream as battering rams that demolished everything in the water's path. The wave was no longer 140 feet. The canyon had widened and the water had spread, but it was still 40 feet high, moving fast and carrying with it the accumulated debris of everything it had already destroyed: houses, vehicles, livestock, trees, concrete, bodies. At 1:30 in the morning, the night telephone operator in Santa Paula received an urgent call from the chief operator of the Pacific Long Distance Telephone Company. The St. Francis Dam had broken. A wall of water was sweeping down the Santa Clara Valley. The operator called Highway Patrolman Thornton Edwards. Edwards, dressed, mounted his motorcycle, and rode through the dark, knocking on doors, pounding on windows, and shouting the warning that would earn him the name that followed him for the rest of his life: Paul Revere of the St. Francis Dam disaster. In Fillmore, 8 miles upstream from Santa Paula, Fire Chief Earl Hume got the call, mounted his own motorcycle, and rode east toward the river to warn the families closest to the water. By the time he reached the eastern edge of Fillmore, it was too late. The flood had already arrived. The wave was 40 feet high. Hume was turned back by rising water. In Fillmore, the flood tore through the lower neighborhoods along the river. In Bardsdale, between Fillmore and Santa Paula, the water hit the farming communities in the floodplain. The Gage House on Pasadena Avenue was lifted off its foundation and carried. In that same neighborhood, 5-year-old Margaret Rudkin Meadows woke with her family to find their house surrounded by water and moving. 18 inches of water inside the rooms. There was nowhere to go, no higher ground reachable, no escape. Her mother dressed the children in their Sunday best. They held hands, stood in the center of the bed, and prayed. All of them survived. The house was later moved a mile south to higher ground far from the river. They never lived near the water again. On Giberson Road, Mr. Carrillo had loaded his family into the car and was driving north, away from the rising water. He stopped to warn a friend and neighbor. When he turned back toward his car, he saw it being washed away in the current, his wife and children inside it. Only he and one daughter survived. At the Bardsdale Cemetery, the headstone he erected reads in Spanish, "Remembrance of your husband and your daughter who sent you forth with painful screams and sorrow for having encountered with you the bitter hour of death on March 13th, 1928, where I hope to God that he took pity of you, my loving human beings." Signed, Maria de Jesus S. Carrillo. I found that inscription in the Fillmore Historical Museum archive and spent a long time with it. A man who stopped to do the right thing and lost his family because he stopped. If your family was in the Santa Clara Valley in March of 1928, if they worked the orchards, the ranches, the packing houses, the Edison camps, or if they were among those who rebuilt after the water went down, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment and subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The flood traveled 55 miles before it reached the Pacific Ocean. It arrived at the coast at Montalvo, in the lowlands between Oxnard and Ventura, at approximately 5:30 in the morning. The wave was still nearly 2 miles wide and moving at 6 miles per hour. It carried bodies, debris, concrete, and the remains of entire communities into the sea. Some victims washed ashore as far south as the Mexican border. Others were never recovered. Remains were discovered deep underground near Newhall in 1992. Others were found in the late 1970s. The most recent discovery was in 1994. 66 years after the flood, they were still finding the dead. The exact death toll will never be known. The victims included migrant farm workers, Mexican fruit pickers living in camps along the river, families whose names were not recorded by any agency or employer, and workers at the Edison camps who had arrived recently and whose records were lost in the flood. The official death count in August 1928 was 385. The current estimate is at least 431. In Newhall, at least 78 bodies were stacked at one time inside the Masonic Hall on Railroad Avenue and Market Street, waiting to be identified or buried. In San Francisquito Canyon, high above the flood path, there is a small cemetery. 7 graves, all from the Ruiz family, all killed on the same night. The silent film actor William S. Hart, who lived in Newhall, helped erect a marker. It reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the Santa Clara flood, March 13, 1928, erected by the Newhall Cowboys." At the coroner's inquest, William Mulholland was called to testify. He was asked who was responsible for the design and construction of the dam. He was 62 years old. He had spent 40 years building the water system that made Los Angeles possible. His reputation had been, until 12 hours before the inquest, unassailable. He looked at the jury and said, "I don't blame anyone else, you just fasten it on me. If there was an error in human judgment, I was the human. I won't try to fasten it on anyone else." I keep coming back to that sentence. It is the most direct acceptance of personal responsibility by an engineer in the history of American industrial disasters. No lawyer coached it, no corporate board drafted it, no public relations strategy shaped the language. A man stood before a panel of inquiry and said the words that no company official at U.S. Steel, no railroad superintendent, no mine owner in the history of this channel has ever said. I was the human. Fasten it on me. The investigation revealed what the brief canyon visit had missed. The eastern abutment had been built on an ancient landslide. The Pelona schist was fractured and permeable along its foliation plains. The Sespe Formation on the west absorbed water and weakened under load. The thrust fault beneath the center of the dam created a zone of incompetent rock through which water moved freely. The dam's height had been raised without widening the base. No independent geological review had been conducted. No borings had been drilled into the foundation rock. The dam had been designed, approved, constructed and certified by a single man whose reputation was so large that no one in the city of Los Angeles had questioned his judgment. The system of independent review that would have caught these problems did not exist because no one believed it was necessary when the engineer was William Mulholland. The governor's panel found that the dam had failed due to defective foundations. The state legislature created the Division of Safety of Dams in 1929. California enacted some of the strictest dam oversight laws in the country. Every large dam built in the state after 1929 required an independent geological survey, an independent engineering review, and approval from a state agency wholly separate from the entity that designed and built the structure. The rules that did not exist when Mulholland built the St. Francis Dam became mandatory because his dam killed 431 people without them. Mulholland withdrew from public life. He resigned from the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply. He never built another dam. He never designed another structure. He lived largely in seclusion for the remaining 7 years of his life. He died of a stroke on July 22, 1935. The man who built the system that made Los Angeles possible, who turned a desert into a city whose aqueduct still carries water today, spent his final years carrying the weight of 431 dead in a canyon he had visited once and understood less than he believed. By 1931, 3 years after the disaster, a book about California's water infrastructure did not even mention the St. Francis Dam. The city rebuilt, the towns rebuilt, the orchards were replanted, the dead were buried. The memory was smoothed over as efficiently as the debris was cleared from the Santa Clara River Valley. In 1929, the center section of the dam, the piece that had remained standing and that people had begun calling the tombstone, was dynamited after a teenage boy climbing on it fell to his death. What remains in San Francisquito Canyon today is a scattering of concrete blocks, an occasional twist of reinforcing metal, and a silence that does not explain itself to anyone who happens to find it. I started with an inspection report. A man standing at the base of a dam at noon, watching dirty water leak through the rock, deciding it came from a road cut and not from the foundation that was dissolving beneath 12.4 billion gallons of water. 12 hours later, the dam was gone. The canyon was scoured to bedrock. Tony Harnischfeger and his 6-year-old son were gone. 64 workers at Powerhouse Number 2 were gone. The Ruiz family, all 7 of them, were gone. Mr. Carrillo's wife and children were gone. And 431 people who'd been asleep in the valley below a wall of concrete designed by one man, certified by that man, and built on ground that man had visited once and never tested, were gone. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces, under 40-ton weights, and sometimes behind 185 feet of concrete in a canyon in California, where one engineer's judgment was the only thing between 12 billion gallons of water and the families sleeping downstream, and the engineer was wrong, and there was no one above him to say so. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how a boiler with a hidden crack killed 58 people in a shoe factory in Brockton, that video is on screen now.